Hi, I'm Rebecca Barton, and this is my case study for EDL 854. So, just a little case summary. So, Mr. Stevens runs George Washington Middle School on his own. He does not have an assistant principal, so because of that, he really relies heavily on parents to help him support, um, like through ticket sales, concession stands, just volunteering. He was approached by Mrs. Bowman to pay for her daughter's travel expenses to march in the New York All-State Cheerleader Parade, but he told her no because that's not what the PTA money is for. And at the last home game of the season, all money matched up except for ticket sales that Mrs. Bowman was running. So, category one, problem identification and analysis. What do we know? Well, we know George Washington Middle School has 450 students, which is kind of a small sized middle school. It's declining in population and it really serves low income families. Despite that, it has very strong community involvement and parents volunteer often to help out. They are helping out at sporting events and all kinds of things. So the school really runs because of these parent volunteers. We also know about Daniel Stevens. He's the current principal. It's his fifth year, and he is extremely well liked by the community and the parents. He works really well with his parent leadership that he has. He does not have an assistant principal at his school, so he really relies on parent volunteers to help him out. We also know a little bit about Mrs. Alice Bowman. She has three children. One is currently at the middle school, her daughter Lucy, which is a cheerleader. She was recognized as all-state cheerleader and then invited to march in a parade in New York City. Um, this accomplishment was announced during announcements at school. She really wants the PTA to fund Lucy's trip to New York, which is like $800, but Mr. Stevens said no, that's really not what the PTA the money is used for. So we also know that the last home basketball game of the season is going on. This has drawn a really large crowd. Mrs. Bowman, who volunteers often, is handling ticket sales. She uses pre-numbered tickets, which they use often at the school. And Mr. Stevens is really busy handling all the other stuff at the game, so he's not even involved in the handling of the ticket sales. Mr. Dermis used $50 bill to get into the game. Mrs. Bowman handed Mr. Stevens the money bag after the game, and just like Mr. Stevens always does, he was escorted by the security guard to take the money to the bank. He counted the money in front of the security guard, and the concession money balanced fine. He noticed that tickets 78 through 88 were discarded because they were torn, and then it ends up that the money does not match. There are $50 missing. So what do we know? Well, we know, what do we need to know? We need to know what happened to the 10 tickets. How did they get torn? Were they torn before Mrs. Bowman got them? Were they torn when she got, like, did she tear them? What happened to them? We also need to know if there are procedures in place for volunteers to count money before giving it to Mr. Stevens. And then if there's not, it's probably important to implement something so that the volunteers count the money before he does. We also need to know where the torn tickets are. Did she discard of them? Did she recycle them? Did she put them in like a lockbox? And then we also need to know, is there anyone else that was collecting tickets that night? So let's identify the problem. Mr. Stevens starts to count the money from the basketball game, and the concession money was accounted for, but there's $50 missing from the ticket sales. Mrs. Bowman, who had a disagreement with Mr. Stevens, reported that 10 tickets were torn and not sold, but the missing money totals the 10 unsold tickets. So category two, proposed plan of action and appropriate steps of implementation. I think the first thing we need to do is call Mrs. Bowman and ask where the discarded ticket where they went. I also think we need to call Mrs. Bowman and ask if she recalls collecting a $50 bill from anyone during the game. I think we need to call Mr. Dermis and ask if he happens to have his ticket stub from the game. And then maybe he will recall during that conversation if he really did give him the $50 bill or maybe he forgot. We also need to call all volunteers in for a procedure meeting. And number five, we need to refresh their memory on all money handling procedures. Maybe there aren't any in place and we kind of need to implement some more at this time. And we definitely need to implement that there are always two ticket collectors. So category 3, let's resolve the issues based on promoting the success of all students. So by training all volunteers, this is going to allow for smoother operations, and it's also going to allow the school to continue to have parent volunteers. It's very important that the school has parent volunteers, so we need to do what we can to keep those parents volunteering. We also need to implement a 2-person ticket handling system. This is going to keep all the funds safe, but it's also just going to help protect who attend the athletic events, because then they know that their money is being handled properly. And we also need to ask Mrs. Bowman first, like when we ask her, that it gives her the opportunity to explain and we're not putting blame on her. So category 4, let's debrief the problem. What was I thinking? Well, I was definitely thinking that I was a little too trusting of Mrs. Bowman, especially after her fight. I'm definitely unsure of where the $50 went, but I also feel determined that this issue can get solved. I feel assured that this money would turn up, and I also kind of feel anxious that this is going to cause a rift between parent volunteers and the school. What was I feeling? Well, I was feeling worried that there was not proper procedures in place to prevent this from happening. And I also feel like this situation could happen again without proper training of volunteers. But I'm really proud that um, we handled the conversation appropriately and didn't rush to conclusions and put blame on people that were at the game. But I still am worried about what our relationship with Mrs. Bowman will look like after this. What was I valuing? Well, I'm definitely valuing what Mrs. Bowman and Mr. Dermis have to say about the situation. But I was also valuing that there were so many volunteers that help out at our school. So, unresolved issues. How is Mrs. Bowman going to take the conversation? Where is the missing money at? But also, where are the discarded tickets? Where did they go? If Mr. Dermis still has his ticket stub, um, and then if the money will ever be accounted for. So category 5, reflection. As the school leader, I promoted effective and efficient management of the school or district by making sure that I valued the opinions of all that were involved and not blaming, and also by establishing new policies so this never happens again. I, as the school leader, promoted the social learning of every student by providing more training for the school volunteers, not being quick to blame, and valuing the opinions of everyone that was involved in the situation. And as a school leader, I promoted the student academic learning by providing additional training for all volunteers, providing an additional volunteer to help collect tickets so this doesn't happen again, and really handling the situation with a positive attitude and making sure that I wasn't blaming people.